Good day, one and all. I have a very cool vintage computer to show you today. This is an IBM IntelliStation M Pro model 6898, and this was made in early 1998. This is a purebred, true blue workstation class computer. A couple of years ago when I got my IBM NetVista, I erroneously called it a workstation class computer. It is not, it is just an ordinary business class computer. But this is unequivocally a workstation class computer. And the difference is, while a business class computer is an otherwise ordinary computer, perhaps similar to a consumer grade computer, just with some features that make it more suitable for business use, a workstation class computer is a computer that had the absolute most powerful hardware that was available at the time the computer was built. They're very large because they house a lot of expandability. They have many more onboard capabilities than ordinary computers do, and they represent the absolute pinnacle of the technology that was available at the time they were built. This is a really cool computer, and I'm very excited to show you this computer and demonstrate it for you today. This is another ex-university computer. I got this from my alma mater back in May, I believe. I spotted two of these in a computer lab. I spoke to the person who basically manages that lab, more or less, and said, hey, there's a couple of old IBM IntelliStations there, could I possibly get one? Well, he spoke to the right people and got the okay, and everything was okayed, and I was able to get one of these. So thank you to the person who did that if you are watching. But yeah, this is just an absolutely wicked, this is unlike any other computer I've ever owned. First of all, if it isn't already obvious, this is the largest and heaviest computer I've ever owned, with the possible exception of the IBM Portable PC, which of course is an all-in-one PC. This is just a desktop PC, but is definitely the largest and heaviest of my ordinary desktop PCs, beating out the Dell Dimension XPS D233, which was before my largest and heaviest desktop computer. This computer was extremely powerful for the time, and it houses some impressive onboard hardware features that most ordinary computers do not have. It took me quite a while to get this computer prepared for this video. That's why it took several months. The first problem I had was the very day I got this computer, just a few hours after I got it, the power supply died. It was a silent failure, luckily. Nothing else was harmed. The power supply just silently gave up, made a subtle whining noise, and refused to turn on anymore. Luckily, this computer uses more or less a standard ATX power supply, so I was able to replace the power supply. As most of you know, my main desktop computer, or what used to be my main desktop computer, it's in storage now, was a Dell Optiplex 780, and I had a second spare Dell Optiplex 780. That Optiplex 780 had a couple of issues, and you know, it was more or less a parts machine to me, so what I did was I stole the power supply from that computer, and I took some other worthwhile parts from that computer, and I junked the rest of the computer. But I took the power supply from it, and with some jerry-rigging, it now works perfectly in this computer. So this computer now runs a Dell Optiplex 780 power supply. And I had to do some jerry-rigging and modifications to get it to work with this computer, and I'll show you those later in the video. Second thing that took a long time was getting Windows running properly on this computer. Between the version of Windows that I used and the hardware that's in this computer, it took a while and quite a bit of research to get everything working properly, but I finally did, and we'll talk about what that entailed and everything else in this video as well. So, after a lot of work, I have this computer running pretty much 100% perfectly now, which is awesome. So, let's go over it. Aside from being large and heavy, what separates this computer from ordinary computers? Well, the biggest thing, in my opinion, is that this is a dual CPU workstation. This is a dual CPU capable computer. Unfortunately, I do not have dual CPUs installed right now. It has a single CPU installed, but it does have the slot for a second CPU, and I hope to get a second CPU for this someday. I think Murray might have one that he can send me that might work in this. So what does this have for hardware? Well, this computer is powered by an Intel Pentium 2 processor running at 333 megahertz. I received this computer with 256 megabytes of RAM. I upgraded it to 512, which is the maximum. I've tested it. It will take up to a gigabyte, but from what I've read and have been told, if you put any more than 512, things start to run a little wacky. So I just stick with 512. It's a good amount anyway. Another sort of notable thing that separates this computer from ordinary computers is that this computer originally shipped with 128 megs of RAM, which was an enormous amount of RAM in early 1998. Your baseline in early 1998 was 16 or 32 megabytes. This thing shipped with 128 megs of RAM, which was quite impressive. This takes SD RAM, so that's good. No proprietary stuff I have to deal with. I think it is ECC capable, but it doesn't need ECC RAM. I just have random SD RAM stuck in there, and it works. This thing has the original hard drive in it. It is a 4.2 gigabyte IDE hard drive, an IBM hard drive pre-DeskStar, so it's not one of the drives that are famous for their unreliability. The drive in this computer is working just fine, although it has worn bearings, so it's quite noisy, but I'm totally fine with that. Another notable feature, this computer has an onboard SCSI controller. It's got an onboard Adaptec SCSI controller, which is just totally cool. So you could order one of these to ship with a SCSI hard drive. I was hoping that this would have a SCSI hard drive inside it when I got it, because I can use all the spare hard drives for my Macintoshes that I can get. But alas, it didn't have one. But it has the controller, and that's pretty darn cool. So we'll do a physical overview here. The power button is actually on the top, which is kind of novel. Of course, this thing's so tall. They thought this was the best place to put it instead of on the front. We have activity lights for power, hard drive activity, and Ethernet activity, because this computer actually has onboard 100 megabit Ethernet. It's an Intel EtherExpress Pro 100B. This originally came with a 24x CD-ROM drive. The drive that I got in this unit works, but it doesn't like to read CDRs, and I sort of need that functionality, so I swapped the drive out for this DVD RW drive, which is a preposterous upgrade, but it's what I have and it works just fine, so what the heck. Not a factory option, I don't think, but this thing came, my particular unit has a ZIP 100 drive in it, so that's very cool and it does work. And the standard 3.5-inch floppy drive, 1.4 megabyte, I didn't have to do anything to it, it works just fine. The IntelliStation M Pro. There were several different series of IntelliStations. There was the M Pro, the A Pro, the E Pro. Each series lasted several years. This is one of the earlier models of the M Pro. There were M Pro models in this same case design, which came with Pentium 3 processors. The early Katmai Pentium 3 slot 1, so that's pretty cool. Let's go around the back and see what we have for ports. Looking around the back, first of all, you can see that Dell Optiplex 780 power supply bolted right in. As for the ports, we have PS2 keyboard and mouse, 2 USB 1.1 ports, 2 serial ports, a parallel port, the 100 megabit Ethernet port, which somebody labeled FXP0, so this thing probably ran some form of Unix or BSD. And this thing does have onboard audio. It's Crystal CS4236B audio, and these are the ports for that. And the reason I have memorized what audio chip this thing has is because I had an incredibly hard time getting the audio working properly on this, but I did eventually get it working. There's an external SCSI port, case fan exhaust, and video card. This thing has an onboard AGP slot, and the card installed is the original card. It's a 3D Labs Permedia 2, which is a card I had never heard of until I got this computer. Apparently the 3D Labs Permedia 2 was a workstation class 3D accelerator card that was used in a lot of computers like this one. And surprisingly, I had no problem finding drivers for that. Like many workstation class computers, and like many IBM computers in general, this thing did have a case lock, and unfortunately when I got this thing, the case was locked and nobody had the key to get it open. So when I got the okay to take the computer, I took it down to the shop at school, and they were able to brute force open the case cover. Although the lock looks really beefy on this side, the actual thing that keeps the door locked is just thin plastic, not very strong at all. And the people in the tech shop at school were able to brute force break that plastic latch. And now I can open the case cover, so thanks to them for making that possible. And it's got some remnants of the property of University of New Brunswick sticker. Clearly somebody tried to scrape that off because this is no longer property of the University of New Brunswick. It was formally signed off to me, but I guess they had a hard time getting the rest of it off. Well, they know it's mine and they're definitely not going to miss it, so... let's turn this thing sideways, open the cover, and take a look inside. Opening the case once the lock has been unlocked, or once the lock has been destroyed, in my case, you pull out on the back a little bit and slide it forwards, making sure not to knock the computer open. Oh, and it just sort of falls off. It comes off a little too easy with that lock broken, but no matter. And, right here is the latch that the metal locks onto. It's still in the locked position, and as you can see, they just brute force broke that plastic lug off. There's a little guide here. We'll look at that in a bit. First, we'll look inside the computer itself. Here is inside this behemoth. The drive cage here, you've got the optical drive, zip drive, floppy drive, and then this cage, which houses the hard drive, has room for another hard drive. It's removable. Rather ironically, since I wouldn't think it'd be very healthy, the internal speaker in this thing does have internal sound, so the Windows audio, the operating system audio, can route through this speaker, which is really cool. They put it right next to the hard drive, which I don't think is the best thing ever, but I suppose the magnetism from the speaker would not be nearly strong enough to cause any damage to the hard drive. And the hard drive is IDE. The hard drive is stated October 97. It's an IBM model DHEA 34330. 4.2 gigabyte IDE. Very cool. The motherboard, as you can see, is very large. This might be... oh, what was it called? An XATX motherboard? Extended ATX? Maybe it's called EATX? But this may be that specification of motherboard, although, to be fair, it isn't square in shape. It's got sort of an L shape, so it might not be. It might just be something proprietary. There's your 4 SD RAM slots, 128 megabyte sticks. There's the 3D Labs Permedia 2 card. See, it's got a little brownish purple heatsink on it. I think it's a 4 megabyte card. AGP. So we've got our AGP slot there. 4 PCI slots, one of which is PCI X? Is this PCI X? I'm not sure. Actually, it might be on this. No, it is a proprietary RAID connector of some sort. I guess if you wanted to add hardware RAID to this thing, a RAID card would have an extension that plugs into this proprietary slot extension. But 4 PCI slots, 2 ISA. There's the onboard SCSI controller with 2 different internal SCSI connectors, and then a port that routes to the external connector. So if I unplug this, what is behind this? I've never actually looked. Just another slot like that one. Cool. Plug that back in. Alright, so here you can see the 333 megahertz Pentium 2. Unlike my Dell Dimension XPS D233, which has a big heatsink that's cooled by the case fan, this thing has a small heatsink with its own active cooling. It's got its own fan on there. And here's the second slot for a second CPU. Because there is not a second CPU in this, it instead has this placeholder card. I would assume that it cannot operate with a single CPU if this placeholder card is missing. This thing has a ton of case cooling, so in addition to the case fan in the back, it's got two case fans in the front, which suck in the air, and then the case fan in the back is the exhaust. Although, something really weird here. This thing, originally, when I got it, all the case fans were backwards. This fan was blowing the air inward, and the two case fans were the exhaust blowing the air out the front of the computer. And I asked people online, and nobody had ever heard of a computer whose case fans were arranged this way. The best thing they could come up with was that somebody flipped the fans around in this thing for some reason. So I'm like, alright, seems reasonable enough to me, I'll flip them back. So I flipped the fans back, which took an extremely long time to do and was incredibly difficult because all three of the case fans in this are mounted with these rubber grommets. And the rubber was quite rotten, and I could not get the fans out without snapping the rubber grommets. So I tried for a long time to, preserve the rubber grommets, get them out safely, but in the end what I ended up doing was using zip ties to tie the fan through the holes where the rubber grommets originally went. And this also took a very long time because it's really hard to get a zip tie around these sharp corners. But I got it to work eventually. So as for the power supply issue, so this thing's running a Dell Optiplex 780 power supply. So this thing does take a standard 20-pin ATX power supply. Well, this power supply is 24-pin, so what I ended up having to do was using this ATX extension cable, which I got off eBay for like 99 cents. I was able to just jerry-rig the 24-pin connector into this 20-pin connector. I double-checked. I checked the wiring diagram for 24 and 20-pin to make sure, I was putting this connector in the right way. So in the end, you get a 12-volt, a ground, a 5-volt, and then a white wire not connected, but everything else is connected as it should, and so this power supply functions exactly as it should for this computer. So I just had to use this extension cable to get around that. And the other thing I had to do with this computer, the original power supply, in addition to the 20-pin ATX, it has this little 6-pin connector in there, which a standard ATX power supply, including this one, obviously doesn't have. So what I ended up having to do was cutting the 6-pin connector with some wire off the original power supply, and I cut one of the SATA connectors off this power supply, and I just soldered them. I soldered the wires together, because all this 6-pin connector is an auxiliary connector. It's got 2 grounds, 2 12 volts, and 2 5s. It's got 3 grounds, 1 12 volt, and 2 5 volt. And that's all it is. There's no special signaling or anywhere. It's just an auxiliary power connector. So I was able to just cut a SATA power connector off and just solder ground to ground, 12 to 12, 5 to 5. And it works perfectly. I did test to see if it would boot up without that auxiliary power connector connected at all. It would not. It needs that auxiliary power. So once I soldered that all in, and I covered it with masking tape, and then I covered it with electrical tape, and then again with masking tape. I should probably replace that with heat shrink tubing at some point. It works just fine, so it's friggin' great. It does take a CR2032 clock battery. It was dead. I replaced it, and all is good. And it's got a case intrusion switch, so the computer can detect if the case has been opened while it's turned on, and it will complain to the user, probably upon post, that has happened. Your front fans and the speaker all plug in there. And another really weird thing is that the speaker and the front case fans are covered by this white shroud thing. The speaker actually fits into the shroud. The fans are just being covered by the shroud. And I could not for the life of me figure out how to get the... When I realized I wanted to flip the case fans around, I could not figure out how to even get to the front case fans. I thought maybe this front panel connector came off, and I forget what I even did, but it took a long time, and I think a lot of brute force getting this shroud off, and then brute force getting the front panel off. And it was just really, actually, I don't think I got the front panel off in the end. I think I was able to zip tie the fans in without access to the front of the case. So yeah, it was a lot of heartache getting this thing all set up. But anyway, I think that's pretty much all there is to show inside. What an impressive beast of a computer. Very massive, very heavy, very heavily built, heavy gauge metal that the case is constructed out of. Not terribly intuitive to service. Changing out the hard drive involves removing the cage. Changing out any of the drives in the upper cage involves taking out this screw to remove the upper cage. And I think also this upper cage is secured by a screw on top, which you have to get to by removing the handle assembly to get to that. And actually, I broke one of the latches that holds the handle in place. It holds in place fine when the panel is on, but it doesn't hold in place when it's off. So I can just remove it here and show you what's under that. But there's the other screw that secures the upper drive cage. And there's the board with the 3 activity LEDs and the power button. So there's that. And actually this specifies a manufacture date of September of '97. Well, this computer didn't even go on sale until October of '97. These were sold from October '97 to October '98. The parts on here are all dated late '97, but I'm only assuming it's an early '98 model because the 333 Pentium 2 did not come out until January of '98. So, we'll take a look at this little panel here. So it gives you the motherboard layout, what everything is. Gives you jumper settings, so you do have to set jumpers on this depending on the speed of CPU you are using. There's different ROM modes, different Ethernet operation modes, admin password for getting into the CMOS setup, I assume. And you can even set it so that the floppy drive is read-only, so this was a really configurable machine in case it was used in any special purposes. Memory table. Alright, now I will put this thing back together. I will set it up on the shelf over there, and we will power this thing on. Alright, we're all set up on the shelf here. All connected up, ready to turn on. So for the peripherals, for a monitor, I'm using my IBM 1024 by 768 LCD monitor. For a mouse, I'm using my Mitsumi PS2 optical mouse. And for a keyboard, I'm using my Acer Model 6011 AT keyboard, connected through an AT to PS2 adapter. Now before we boot up, I must talk about what operating system am I running on this? Well, based on this computer's age and specifications, it would make a perfectly fine Windows 95 or 98 machine, but I need to consider the fact that I'm going to upgrade this thing with a second CPU someday. And Windows 95, 98, and ME don't support more than one CPU, which means that to get the full functionality of this computer, I'm limited to the Windows NT based operating systems. So Windows NT 2000 or perhaps XP if you really wanted it on this computer. Well, this computer originally shipped with Windows NT 4.0. And there's a sticker for it right there. It says designed for Windows NT. And I've never had a computer that ran Windows NT as a dedicated machine. I've dabbled around with Windows NT a couple of times over the years, but I never put it as a serious operating system on one of my computers, because Windows NT is even though it's the predecessor to Windows 2000 and XP, Windows NT is a completely different beast from either of those operating systems. It is very different from any other Windows operating system. And if you're not experienced with using Windows NT, it actually has a bit of a learning curve to it as far as getting hardware set up and working properly. So I considered Windows NT. I also considered Windows 2000 because I'm familiar with Windows 2000, and Windows 2000's easy to set up. But I already have two computers that run Windows 2000. They're both Pentium 4s with more RAM than this thing has, and so there's no purpose to putting Windows 2000 on this. So I decided to go all in, and I've made this my first dedicated Windows NT computer. I've decided to keep this computer original, and I've installed Windows NT Workstation 4.0. So this is the first time I've ever used Windows 4.0 for realsies, rather than just tinkering around with it for a couple of hours. As I said, Windows NT has a bit of a learning curve to it, and I definitely had to overcome that when getting Windows NT installed and running properly on this computer. Windows NT, for example, doesn't have Device Manager. And it doesn't have pretty much doesn't have any automated hardware detection. There's no plug and play or anything like that. Everything has to be done manually. As a matter of fact, drivers for Windows NT don't even have their own installation programs, because Windows NT doesn't work that way. When you get the driver from a manufacturer for a piece of hardware for Windows NT, they just gave you the system files and said, good heckin' luck. Because you had to install it manually. You had to go into the control panel, go into the right control panel for what the type of hardware you were trying to set up, and then click the Add Hardware button and manually put in all the settings for that hardware. If you were lucky, the driver would specify a default set of settings like port, IRQ, stuff like that. And if you were lucky, that would work properly. If you weren't lucky, you had a lot of tinkering you had to do to get that piece of hardware running properly in Windows NT. Totally different beast from 2000 XP or from 95, 98. Very, very different beast. And I had some difficulties getting Windows NT running properly on this computer. Namely, I spoke about before, I had trouble getting the sound hardware working. In particular, I got the sound hardware to work, except it wouldn't work out the internal speaker. It'd work out the headphone port just fine, but it wouldn't work out the built-in speaker. Basically, I tried a bunch of different drivers that I found. A lot of them just didn't work because I had no idea what I was doing in Windows NT, and at best, some would work, but without the internal speaker working. What turned out to be the solution in the end, which I kind of face-palmed over, is that Windows NT already has it doesn't have a built-in driver for the hardware, but it has built-in awareness of the particular sound chip in this thing. When you go to add a sound driver, it's in the list of sound drivers. So you click it in the list and you click add the hardware, but then it asks you for a couple of files. All I had to do, it asked for a couple of DLLs and a .sys file, and all I had to do was Google those 3 files, put them on a floppy disk, feed it to Windows. Windows loaded the files, and bada bing bada boom, I had perfect working sound, including the internal speaker. So it's so weird to get hardware working in Windows. It's really, really strange. I also had trouble getting the Ethernet card working properly, getting this thing on the internet. I will demonstrate this thing going on the internet in this video. Same thing with the sound hardware. Windows NT was aware of the Ethernet card in this thing, but it didn't have all the driver files needed for it. So you'd click it in a list and then it would ask you for some files and you feed it to it and then it would work. And unlike the sound card, drivers for the Ethernet adapter were quite easy to find. But that's not enough, of course. Unlike other versions of Windows, Windows NT doesn't assume what kind of network you're running. You know, other versions of Windows assume that you're going to be on a TCP/IP network, and you want to get on the internet through that network, and it assumes that you're going through a router or a gateway with DHCP and DNS and all this stuff that is basically just plug and play. Windows NT, you got to put in all that stuff manually. So I got the Ethernet driver installed, and then you try to go on the internet, and Windows NT is like, what the hell do you want? Because Windows NT doesn't assume anything. It's up to you to tell it what you want to do. Windows NT is like, what are you doing? Do you want TCP/IP? Do you want NetBEUI? Do you want Apple Talk? It's just like, so you have to go through all the motions of setting that up. So once you got the Ethernet driver installed, you had to go in the control panel and go into the network settings and install the TCP/IP stack and tell it that you want to associate that TCP/IP stack with the Ethernet adapter and go through all this other stuff. And in the end, this thing now goes on the internet, but the hilarious part is, if I try to go into Network Neighborhood, because I currently have a computer running in this house with running FreeNAS just as an experiment. So I have a network storage on a computer running FreeNAS, and when I went to Network Neighborhood on this computer to try and add it as a network drive, I click on Network Neighborhood and it says, the network is not installed. Do you want to install the network? And I'm like, what do you mean the network's not installed? I'm friggin' accessing the internet right now on this computer. Anyway, so there's something else I haven't set up, and you click on Network Neighborhood and it says the network doesn't exist. And it says this while it's accessing the internet perfectly fine. So it's so weird. Windows NT is so weird. But I'm satisfied with the level of which I've gotten things working, but just beware when toy around with Windows NT. It is a weird, weird beast. Even Murray, who's way smarter with stuff like this than I am, has told me he tried Windows NT once and just gave up because of how weird it was. He doesn't have it running on any of his computers. So, anyway, enough of that blabbering. Let's turn this thing on. This computer has an incredibly long boot up process. It takes a couple of minutes to boot because the post is really long and there's a lot of steps involved. And I'll film the whole thing to show you how long it takes. So let me turn my light out and hit the power button. And we're off like a herd of turtles. Video card, boot ROM. At this point, we can press a key to go into the BIOS setup. I will do that later because it actually takes a long time to get into the BIOS. It's counted up the RAM, 512 megabytes. $640K of the conventional memory. Detects a floppy drive. The onboard SCSI controller, polling for devices. Floppy disk check, and finally we are booting into Windows NT Workstation 4.0. And Windows NT has quite a unique startup process. You get this blue screen. Detects how many processors and how much RAM it finds. I have updated Windows NT. I've got it updated up to Service Pack 6, and with a bunch of updates that came out after Service Pack 6. And something really sad that happened while I was getting Windows NT ready for this video was I was installing a bunch of updates I found online, some of which I couldn't find download links for anymore. Somebody made a guide on how to update Windows NT, and some of the links were just broken and I couldn't find them anywhere else. So we're about to log on here. I did a registry modification so it logs me on automatically. Normally it would ask for a username and password. Nice startup sound. I like the Windows NT startup sound. I found this background on Google Images. Happened to be 1024 by 768. So yeah, I found a bunch of post Service Pack 6 updates. Some of the download links were broken. Couldn't find them anywhere else, so I just installed what updates I had. And one of the updates I had was a Spanish language update. And of course, before I go on, installing the post Service Pack 6 updates on this thing was an incredibly long task because after every update you have to reboot the computer, and rebooting this thing takes like 3 minutes because of how long it takes to start up. So it was a very time-consuming process, very exhausting. One of the updates that I installed, when I opened the update program, the dialog box was in Spanish. It said in Spanish, "Do you want to install this update?" And I hummed and hawed because I'm like, is this okay, Spanish language update? But it was just a security update. It was only 110 kilobytes in size. So I said, well, it can't hurt anything. So I clicked yes, and it installed it. Turned half the operating system Spanish. And I asked people online, and I did some research, and I could not find a way to turn things back to full US English. I ended up wiping the whole hard drive and starting all over. After I got all the hardware working properly and everything, I had ended up having to wipe the entire hard drive and start all over because that one tiny security update turned half the operating system Spanish. It's so aggravating. So I did it all again, minus that particular update, and everything's working just fine. So let's look at the System Properties page. Looks similar to other versions of Windows, Microsoft Windows NT 4.0. And something hilarious is now Windows NT 4.0 comes with Internet Explorer 2.0. I installed Internet Explorer 4.0 Service Pack 2 to get the Windows Desktop update. And then I installed Internet Explorer 6 Service Pack 1, which is the latest version of Internet Explorer that Windows NT can run. After installing Internet Explorer 6, the version number it gives, it says Internet Explorer 5 version 6.0, which is just hilarious. And there's the computer information. It's a 333 Pentium 2, Deschutes core, 512 megs of RAM. And we have some tabs that aren't like what you get in other versions of Windows. No device manager. Going to my computer here. So without the Windows Desktop update, Windows NT 4.0 as a whole has a user interface mostly similar to Windows 95, and of course when you install the Windows Desktop update, you get the updated Explorer windows and other stuff just like you get when you install the Windows Desktop update on Windows 95. There's the hard drive, how much I've used, how much is remaining. Windows NT automatically detects the zip drive, unlike Windows 95 and 98, in which you have to install the driver, so that's quite impressive, considering Windows NT is even older than Windows 98. Windows NT came out in, Windows NT 4.0 came out in 1996, and it automatically supports the zip drive, quite impressive. Picks up the DVD-RW drive, although it probably only sees it as a CD-ROM drive. And yeah. As for other things I have installed, I have Winamp installed, so we'll open Winamp. It's not the fastest computer. And we'll play the little tune it comes with.
It really whips the llama's ass.
Nice speaker in here. It's got really nice sound. Play it again here.
The llama's ass.
Well, I say that now. It's got a bit of distortion to it, but It's got good bass response and the volume's good, so yeah, pretty nice. I'm running Winamp version 5.094. Newer versions of Winamp will install. I tried up to version 5.35, however when you open them, you get a DLL error, although the program still opens after you dismiss that error and seems to work just fine. So I installed 5.094 and it doesn't give me that error. It seems to work just fine, so that's the version I would recommend to use. Or 2.95 might work just fine. I have Microsoft Office XP installed, the last version of Office that Windows NT 4.0 can run, so I'll open Microsoft Word here. So here's Microsoft Word 2002, about Microsoft Word, and I did install Service Pack 3 for Microsoft Office XP. I haven't tried the Office 2007 compatibility pack yet, so I'll have to try that and see if it works on this. The copy I have, I know it works on Office. No! Why are you here to torture me? Oh, every time. I know that the copy I have works with Office 2003. I don't know if it works with Office XP. I'll have to try that. I know there were at least some versions of the Office 2007 compatibility pack that worked with Office 2000 and XP. I don't know if there's a copy that works with all three. I don't know. All I know is the one I have works with 2003. So I'll have to try it at some point. You can go away forever. Thank you. And yeah, we'll close out of that. I guess the only other thing I have to demonstrate is I do have Firefox installed. I have Firefox 2.0.0.20 installed, which is the last version of Firefox that Windows NT 4.0 can run. So I need to hook up to the internet, so I've got an Ethernet cable here. I just got to plug it into this and plug the other end into my laptop, which can share its internet connection. And we'll open Firefox and see what it's like to surf the internet on a early 1998 workstation running Windows NT. Alright, I'm plugged into the ThinkPad T420S. Let's open Firefox and see if we have internet access. You can see the Ethernet light blinking away. We might not actually be connected to the internet yet. Alright, found the problem. It was actually my laptop's fault. My laptop was confused by having been woken up with an Ethernet cable plugged into it, so my laptop thought that this thing was an internet router, and anyway, my laptop wasn't connected to the internet. But now it is. So let's see if we can get on a website. Yes, it has connected. And it can't start the Firefox homepage because this web browser is 10 years old. So let's go to m.facebook.com/maritimegirl. Turn my exposure up once again. Yay! And we're on my Facebook page. Woohoo! Cool. And yeah, we can go to Google. And we can't do a whole lot else because this is a really old computer running a really old web browser. But, poop. So yeah, perfect. Google works, pretty much. So that's sweet. Other than that, there isn't really a whole lot more to demonstrate, I don't think. I don't know if Winamp has connection to any, like, internet radio or anything like that. I know the latest version does. I can't remember if any of the older ones do. Not that I know how to... neat. Not that I know how to use Winamp anyway. The last time I used it seriously was, 15 years ago. Anyway, I'll show you some weird oddities of Windows NT. For example, if I click on Network Neighborhood, it says, unable to browse the network. The network is not present or not started. This is actually probably because when I first got the Ethernet driver installed, every time I started Windows, Windows would complain that a couple of the network services couldn't start, and I just disabled those services. Perhaps those services are necessary for network neighborhood to work, so whatever. But we'll go into the control panel. And a lot of stuff is familiar. This isn't familiar, this console option. Although in Windows 95-98, this might be there, it's just called MS-DOS option. The display options are familiar. We get a dedicated 3D Labs tab, the video card. Another thing about Windows NT, Windows NT does not have DirectX support. Microsoft never gave Windows NT DirectX support. It's limited only to OpenGL. I learned that from a very old boss of mine, who I believe had a brother or something way back in the day who tried Windows NT on a personal computer and found out it was no good for gaming because there was no DirectX support. And I forget if this came with Windows NT or it was part of Service Pack 6, but you do get the limited subset of plus options that let you use the Windows 98 style My Computer, Network Neighborhood, and Recycle Bin icons. Before, they looked just like the Windows 95 version. Eight megabytes of RAM, which was quite a lot for a video card in 1998. Intel Pro set, that's the Ethernet driver, or the Ethernet adapter settings. Intel 82557 base 10100 Ethernet PCI 100 base TX 10 base T. That's not correct because it's not an Intel 82557. It's an Intel Pro 100B, which maybe is an 82557, but I recall when I installed the driver, in addition to Pro 100B, another one of the driver options was Intel 82557, and I installed that and it didn't work, and when I installed Pro 100B it did work, so maybe a Pro 100B is an 82557, maybe it isn't, I don't know. Internet options with the Windows XP icon because this came with Internet Explorer 6. So this thing doesn't have a modem installed, but Windows NT puts the modem icon there because, once again, there's no central way for installing hardware. It has to have the modem icon there, so in case you do have a modem, you can install it. So there's a lot of icons that are here just in case. They don't actually apply to this computer. Multimedia settings, there's that crystal audio. I haven't tried the MIDI yet. I should open Media Player and try the MIDI. Can Winamp do MIDI? We'll see if Winamp can do MIDI. Probably can. I don't think it's loading. Sometimes this computer, you go to open stuff and it just doesn't do it. And I think that's just Windows NT being contrary. Okay, apparently Winamp just is not going to work anymore. Maybe I should go with an older version of Winamp. Maybe I should install Winamp 2.95. Because maybe 5.094 isn't liking this very much. So you get the loading cursor and then it just goes away. If I open the task manager, and Windows NT has the task manager that debuted with Windows, or that continued with Windows 2000 and XP, so this looks familiar, you can see. Winamp, sort by name. Oh, Winamp decided to open. Lovely. It only took a whole minute for some reason. Let me go play file. See, WinNT, media. Is Passport here? I like Passport. Yeah, it is. Okay, with very rudimentary Microsoft MIDI emulation. I guess it's not Microsoft GS emulation. It is Crystal's own MIDI synthesizer, which doesn't sound very good. But then again, Crystal was mostly business audio, so MIDI quality wasn't of the utmost importance. Well, cool, MIDI works. Going to the network settings. Windows NT networking is not installed. So yeah, I ain't gonna play with what I don't know. For backwards compatibility, my work group name is still Trent. That's lovely. So yeah, there were other services here, but I removed them because they were complaining. Maybe it was just because I was using this computer without it connected to the internet. I don't know. Well, I think that's all there is to demonstrate for Windows NT 4.0 on this computer. Definitely a very unique and rather challenging operating system, but once you figure it out and manage to get things working, it runs pretty well, and it's definitely a unique experience to use. But I'm going to restart, and we'll take a quick look at the BIOS setup, and then we'll call it a video. Oh, this has happened before. Yeah, this happened last time I tried to shut down. I don't know what's going on. I'll have to look that up. And Winamp is complaining. Jeepers creepers. Yeah, I might be trying an older version of Winamp, 2.95 or something. And of course, another quirk about Windows NT is that it does not have ACPI support. So when you shut down a computer, even if the computer itself supports ACPI, it gets to the actually, you know what, I'm gonna have to turn it off because it doesn't give the F1 prompt when you restart. It only gives it when you boot up. When you shut down a computer, even if it has ACPI support, Windows will say you may now safely turn off your computer, at which point you have to hit the power button. It's not because Windows NT was too old. Of course, Windows 95 had ACPI support, but it's because Microsoft decided that a workstation class operating system doesn't need ACPI support. So, fair enough. There are ways that, like, I've read that there's a registry modification you can do to enable automatic shutdown on an ACPI capable machine. I tried that, and what it ended up with is when you went to shut down, it restarted the computer, so that obviously didn't work for me. So it's going to go through the SCSI card polling devices, and then it's going to go into the BIOS setup screen. And there's the BIOS setup screen. So we can go to System Summary. It shows we have a Pentium 2 333, 512 kilobytes of cache. We're not dual processor capable currently. 512 megs of RAM, non-parity, per Media 2 video card, 1.4 meg floppy, 4.2 gig hard drive, detects IDE CD-ROM drive, and it says IDE Direct Access Device 3 installed. That's the zip drive. Product, machine type model, and I did update this thing to the newest BIOS, which is dated 2001, so IBM supported this machine for 4 years almost. And after that, it's just a lot of your typical setup stuff. Power on self-test is set to quick. I haven't measured how long it takes when it's set to enhanced. So this does support APM power management, where the computer itself, on the computer itself you can set when the display turns off, when the hard drive spools down, stuff like that. I had that originally enabled, and then I just disabled it because I don't really care to have any of the power saving features on this. This computer is going to barely run. Who cares how much power it uses while it's running? So yeah, that's it. So that's about all there is to show of the IBM IntelliStation M Pro model 6898. We'll exit setup here, and then I'll just cut the power off. Ethernet activity, even though there's no operating system running. And it's not going to respond to the power button, so I'm just going to hit my switch. So there you go. What a neat vintage computer. Very unique. I have no other computer like it in my collection. Really neat piece of technology and definitely fun to use. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.